Hi, welcome to English Hamster. Are you learning English? Great. Here we learn through stories. They are simple and interesting. You can improve English while learning knowledge. Remember to subscribe, like and comment. Let's get started.
Hi, welcome to English Hamster. Today we will tell the story of World War I. Part 1, The Spark That Set the World on Fire. In the year 1914, Europe was like a house with weak walls, waiting for a small shake to make it fall apart. Countries were competing for power, growing their armies, and making secret promises to each other. Everyone was watching each other with suspicion, and the air was filled with tension. One small event could cause a huge explosion. On June 28, 1914, the sun was shining over the city of Sarajevo, Bosnia. People were excited because Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the next in line to rule Austria-Hungary, was visiting. The streets were full of flags, and people were cheering as they waited to see him. With him was his wife, Sophie, who smiled and waved at the crowd. They had come for an official visit, but underneath the excitement, Sarajevo was a place filled with anger. Many Serbs hated Austrian rule and dreamed of a free Serbia. Among the crowd, there were people with a plan to stop the Archduke. One of them was a young man named Gavrilo Princip. He was 19 years old, small and thin, with dark eyes full of determination. He belonged to a secret group called the Black Hand. Their goal was simple: to kill Franz Ferdinand and send a message to Austria. The Archduke's car, a simple open-topped vehicle, moved slowly through the streets. The crowd cheered, but the assassins were waiting. Suddenly, one of them threw a bomb. It flew through the air, heading straight for the car, but at the last moment, Franz Ferdinand saw it and threw it away. Boom! The bomb exploded, shattering windows and hurting officers and civilians. Smoke filled the street, and people screamed and ran in every direction. The assassins fled, knowing they had failed. The police caught one of them quickly, but the Archduke was still alive. He should have left the city right away, but instead, he made a decision that would cost him his life. Franz Ferdinand insisted on going to visit the hospital to see the officers who had been hurt in the bombing. His driver was nervous, but the Archduke was stubborn and refused to leave. As they drove, the driver made a wrong turn onto a narrow street. At that moment, Gavrilo Princip, the assassin, was standing outside a cafe. He had been waiting, thinking the mission had failed. But then he saw the Archduke's car. It had stopped right in front of him. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear. He took out his gun, one deep breath. He fired. A bullet hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. A second shot struck Sophie in the stomach. The driver, in a panic, sped away. Blood spread across Franz Ferdinand's uniform. He tried to speak, but he choked on his own blood. Sophie, already unconscious, fell onto him. Within minutes, both of them were dead. Europe would never be the same again. The news spread quickly. Austria-Hungary was furious and blamed Serbia for the assassination. They demanded that Serbia punish the people responsible. But Serbia, supported by Russia, refused to give in. Austria-Hungary saw this as an act of defiance. Exactly 1 month after the assassination, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, who had an alliance with Serbia, declared war on Austria-Hungary. The chain reaction started. Germany, Austria-Hungary's closest ally, declared war on Russia. France, who was allied with Russia, declared war on Germany. Germany, eager to attack, marched into Belgium to attack France. Britain, who had promised to protect Belgium, declared war on Germany. In just 1 week, all of Europe was at war. Men rushed to enlist, believing the war would be short. "It will be over by Christmas," they said, but they had no idea what was coming. This war would last 4 years. It would kill millions. It would change the world forever. Part 2: The World on Fire. It was August 1914, and the streets of Europe were buzzing. But this wasn't the excitement of a happy celebration. It was the buzz of war. Thousands of men, both young and old, were running to the recruiting stations, ready to fight for their country. Many of them were excited, thinking the war would be over quickly. They believed they would return home as heroes, but they had no idea that they were walking into the most terrible war the world had ever seen. There was no way back now. In Germany, the streets were full of people with hope for their country. The people believed their country would win. Germany had one of the most powerful armies in Europe, and the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was confident that Germany would defeat everyone else. He sat at his desk, looking over his plans. He believed in his country's strength, and he was sure that Germany would rule Europe. Austria-Hungary was also angry after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The leaders of Austria-Hungary saw this as an opportunity to show their power in the Balkans. The empire was weak and divided, but they believed the war could be a way to prove their strength. Russia, the biggest country in Europe, had a different feeling. The Russian Empire was huge, but it was not ready for war. The soldiers were not well equipped or trained, and there was a lot of disagreement in the country. But Tsar Nicholas II, the leader of Russia, knew he had to defend Serbia, who was their ally. So, the Russian army marched toward the battlefield, hoping to show their strength and protect their interests. Across Europe, people felt uneasy. The alliances, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on one side, Russia, France, and Britain on the other, were pulling everyone into the storm. But no one knew how much this war would change everything. The war started. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Germany believed it was the best way to protect its borders and secure its future. The very next day, France declared war on Germany to support its ally, Russia. On August 3, Germany invaded Belgium and marched toward France, hoping to defeat France quickly and avoid fighting on 2 fronts. Germany did not care that Belgium was a neutral country. They wanted to win quickly. The Belgian army fought bravely, but they were not strong enough. Thousands of people fled, running away from the German soldiers. The Germans took control of the capital city, Brussels. The world watched in horror as the Germans invaded, burning villages and destroying towns. The brutality of the invasion shocked everyone, but there was a ripple effect. Britain, who had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914 now. It was not just a few countries in the war, Europe was burning. Every country was involved. As the war continued, something surprising happened. Instead of quick victories, the war turned into a slow and painful battle. Soldiers on both sides dug trenches, long, deep holes in the ground where they lived, fought, and died. This was where the war truly began to change. For the next 4 years, millions of men would live in these trenches. They fought for small pieces of land that would cost them everything. Imagine being a soldier, waking up in the morning. The first thing you feel is the cold mud beneath you. The smell of sweat, blood, and decay fills the air. Above the ground, there are explosions, gunfire, and the constant sound of death. The soldiers are always under attack. Sometimes it's machine guns, Other times it's bombs that explode overhead. But it wasn't just the fighting that was terrifying. It was the mental toll of being in the trenches. The constant fear of dying, the hopelessness. They were stuck in the trenches with no way out. The war felt endless. Each day was a fight just to stay alive. The Western Front, a long line of trenches stretching across Belgium and northern France, became the most terrifying part of the war. In these muddy trenches, soldiers fought for months, sometimes over just a few meters of land. No matter how hard they fought, no matter how many soldiers died, they couldn't move forward. The Germans were on one side and the Allied forces, Britain, France, and later the United States, were on the other. It felt like a deadlock. The fighting never stopped, but neither side gained anything. One of the first major battles of the war was the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The Germans had gotten very close to Paris, and it seemed like they might win quickly. But the French and British forces fought back and stopped the Germans just in time. The Germans had to retreat, and the front lines settled into a slow and painful trench war. But it wasn't just soldiers who were suffering. Civilians also paid a heavy price. Towns were destroyed. Homes were lost. Families were torn apart. Many civilians were forced to leave their homes and flee for safety. The Eastern Front between Russia and Austria-Hungary was just as terrible, but it was different. The Russian army was large, but it was poorly prepared. Germany and Austria-Hungary pushed Russia back, and the Russian soldiers suffered from hunger and the cold. But the war went on. Months passed, and the soldiers began to realize that they were stuck. They were trapped in a cycle of violence that seemed endless. The war, which everyone thought would be over quickly, was now stretching into years. The fighting didn't stop. The suffering didn't end. There were brief moments of calm when soldiers in the trenches could hear nothing but silence. But these moments never lasted long. Suddenly, artillery shells would explode and the war would start again. The soldiers knew that the war was always there, always a threat. Part 3. The war rages on. Imagine yourself in the middle of a battlefield. The sky is gray, filled with the sound of explosions and gunfire. There's no way to escape the noise, the chaos, the fear. The air smells of smoke, death, and mud. You're cold, you're hungry, and you don't know how long you'll survive. This is trench warfare, where men fight not for glory or honor, but just to stay alive. In the trenches, soldiers live in terrible conditions. They sleep in cold, wet places, often lying in mud, surrounded by rats, dirt, and the bodies of the dead. The mud is so deep that it feels like it will swallow you whole. There is nowhere to hide for miles, only dirt, barbed wire, and the constant sound of gunfire in the distance. Every soldier in the trench faces the same nightmare. But it's not just the physical conditions that break them. The mental toll is even worse. Every day, they fear being shot, blown up, or dying from disease. Many soldiers develop a condition called shell shock, where the constant pressure of war makes them lose their minds. Many will never recover from the mental scars of war. The constant waiting, the fear of the unknown, the feeling that death is just around the corner. It's more than most can handle. New weapons of destruction. In the trenches, soldiers face not only bullets and shrapnel, but also new, deadly weapons that change the way wars are fought. In 1915, the Germans used poison gas for the first time. Imagine this: a green cloud rolls over the battlefield, bringing with it death and pain. Soldiers are caught off guard. Some die slowly, suffocating as they struggle to breathe. The gas doesn't care who you are, it just takes your life. The smell of it is enough to make any soldier terrified. They never know when it will come, but when it does, there is no place to hide. But poison gas is just one of the new weapons. Along with it came machine guns, big artillery shells, and even the first tanks. The tanks, which were supposed to change the way wars were fought, were slow and awkward, but they could crush soldiers under their heavy wheels. As these new weapons were used, the fighting became even worse. Soldiers who had once thought the war would be over soon now realized that this war was something completely different. It wasn't about glory anymore, it was about survival. One of the most brutal battles of the war happened in February 1916, the Battle of Verdun. The French knew Verdun was important. It was a symbol of French strength. If they lost it, it would be a huge blow to their pride and their hope. The Germans, under General Erich von Falkenhayn, had a plan to bleed the French army dry. Their goal was simple: to cause so many deaths among the French that they would have to give up. They knew the French would fight to the last man to protect Verdun, and they were right. The battle lasted nearly 10 months, with many soldiers dying every day. Soldiers fought for every inch of land. The fighting was so intense that each day felt like an eternity. The soldiers lived in deep, cold bunkers, trying to stay safe from the constant bombings. The French soldiers fought bravely for their country, but the Germans were just as determined. By the end of the battle, both sides had lost nearly 300,000 men each, and for what? Nothing had changed. The front lines didn't move, and the soldiers were no closer to winning the war than before. As the war dragged on, the nature of warfare continued to change. This was no longer a war of brave charges and knights riding horses. This was a war of machines, of death from a distance. Soldiers weren't fighting face to face anymore. They were fighting in trenches, behind barbed wire, using weapons that could kill from far away. But what's even worse was the terrible cost of the war. Generations of young men were being wiped out. These were boys, many still with dreams of their future, sent off to die in a foreign land. They weren't fighting for freedom. They were fighting because they had been told it was their duty. For the families at home, the war became an endless waiting game. Mothers, wives, and children waited for letters, hoping their loved ones were still alive. They clung to every word, reading each letter over and over, looking for signs that their soldier was safe. But for many families, the letters stopped coming. The only message they received was the dreaded news of death. The war was changing the world, and not just on the battlefield. Entire villages were destroyed. Cities were burned. The war was taking a toll on everyone, not just the soldiers. The war spreads, new fronts open. As the war continued, it spread to other parts of the world. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening a new front in the Middle East. The Gallipoli campaign, which the Allies thought would be an easy victory, ended in disaster. Thousands of men lost their lives for almost no gain. The Ottoman soldiers fought fiercely, just like the European forces, but the fighting in this region was just as brutal and deadly as it was in Europe. In Africa, the war was fought on a different level. The Allied forces fought against the Germans over colonies and land. But the native soldiers who fought in Africa often didn't fully understand why they were fighting. They fought for countries that were not their own. They fought enemies they had never met. But still, they fought because war had become a reality for everyone, no matter where they were. Part 4: The Turning Tide of the War. As the years went on, the war showed no signs of ending. It became clear that both sides were not only fighting for victory, but for survival. The war had become a monster, and each side was doing everything they could to outlast the other. The fighting felt endless. It seemed like there would be no end to the suffering. The French, the British, and the Germans, everyone was exhausted. Millions of soldiers had died. Families had lost their loved ones. And still, there was no clear winner in sight. Imagine being a soldier, stuck in a trench. Day after day, you face the same enemy, the same explosions, the same gunfire. The smell of death fills the air. You're cold, hungry, and scared. You begin to wonder if there's anything worth fighting for anymore. But despite everything, the soldiers kept fighting, not for glory, but because they had to. They had no choice. By 1917, things were looking bad for the Allies. The Central Powers, led by Germany, were pushing hard. The Allied forces, which included France and Britain, were getting weaker. The soldiers were exhausted. The French soldiers had been fighting for years, and they had nothing left. The British forces were also struggling. But then, in 1917, something happened. The United States joined the war, bringing new hope, energy, and resources to the Allied side. The arrival of American soldiers was like a breath of fresh air for the Allies. They brought new strength, new soldiers, and new weapons. Suddenly, the Allies had a chance to win the war. The Germans, who had once been confident, now realized they were facing an enemy they could not defeat alone. The U.S. soldiers, full of patriotism and ready to fight, didn't know the full horror of the war they were entering. But their numbers were huge, and with them came new technology and modern tactics that would help change the course of the war. The Allies' Great Offensive begins. In 1918, with the help of fresh American soldiers, the British and French forces launched a massive attack. This was no longer about fighting for a small piece of land. It was the last chance to win. The Allies knew they had to make their move now before the Germans could push them any further. The Allied forces moved forward with strength they hadn't had in years. For the first time in a long time, they were gaining ground. The Germans, who had been so sure of their victory, were now shocked. The power of the United States, combined with the determination of the British and French soldiers, was too much for them. As the Allies pushed forward, there was hope, but also fear. Everyone knew this could be the end of the war, but no one knew how many lives would be lost before it was over. The Germans, who had been fighting so long in the trenches, were pushed further and further back. They kept fighting, but with each step the Allies took, it felt like the end was coming closer. The Central Powers began to collapse. As the Allies moved forward, something incredible began to happen. The Central Powers started to fall apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the main countries on the Central Powers side, began to break down. Its soldiers were exhausted. The empire was old, weak, and falling apart. By October 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Allies. This was a huge moment. It meant that the Central Powers were no longer united. Germany, the last strong country on their side, was now alone. The Allies had defeated Austria-Hungary, and they could focus all their energy on Germany. Germany, too, was feeling the pressure. The soldiers had been fighting for years, and they were tired. Their supplies were running low, and their morale was at an all-time low. In November 1918, after months of heavy fighting, the German government asked for an armistice, a ceasefire. It was over. The war had finally come to an end. The end of the war, the aftermath. On November 11, 1918, at 11:00 a.m., the guns fell silent. The world held its breath. The war was over. For the first time in 4 long years, there was peace. But the soldiers who had been fighting for so long looked at the battlefield and realized that the cost of peace was too high. The world was in ruins. Millions of people were dead. Millions more were wounded. Entire families had been destroyed. Cities were reduced to rubble. The world was scarred physically and emotionally. The suffering, loss, and pain were beyond words. But even in the middle of all the sorrow, there was a feeling of relief, a feeling of hope. The nightmare was over. The soldiers could go home, but they would never be the same. The war had changed them forever. After 4 years of constant fighting, the war had left a mark so deep that its effects would last for generations. 20 million people, 20 million lives were lost. The numbers were almost impossible to understand. Entire cities wiped out, families destroyed, all because of this war. The soldiers who died were not just numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. They were people who had dreams, who had lives before the war. Their names would be remembered, but their stories would always be a reminder of the terrible cost of war. The price of victory. Though the Allies had won the war, the price of that victory was beyond anyone's expectations. What was the point of winning when the cost was so high? Victory had become meaningless. There were no celebrations in the streets, only the quiet mourning of those who had returned and the wailing of those who had lost loved ones. Even the leaders who had signed the peace treaty couldn't escape the fact that the world had changed forever. Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany, once a proud ruler of an empire, had been forced to leave the throne. Austria-Hungary, once a powerful empire, had been torn apart. The great empires of Europe were now gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had all fallen under the weight of war. Part 5. The soldiers who returned. And what about the soldiers who made it back? The men who had survived the battlefields, who had seen horrors beyond imagination? They came home, but they were never truly the same. The physical scars were obvious, missing limbs, wounds that would never heal. But the emotional scars were hidden deep inside them. The war had broken something inside them that could never be fixed. Imagine being one of these men, walking back into a world that feels completely different. A world where people talk about peace and happiness, but you've seen the worst of humanity. You've watched your friends die, heard the screams, and smelled the smoke of burning towns. How could you return to normal life after all that? Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't understood back then, but many of these men carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares, flashbacks, feelings of guilt, these were the hidden wounds that would never heal. They had survived the war, but at what cost? They had lost their innocence, their hopes, and their futures. Many of them couldn't reintegrate into normal society. The world had moved on, but they had been left behind, stuck in the shadows of war. A world reborn. In the aftermath of the war, there was also a sense of rebuilding. New countries were born from the ashes of the old empires. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged, carved from the lands of the broken Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its lands were divided among the victorious Allies, changing the face of the Middle East forever. The Russian Empire fell as well, leading to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks took control, leading to the rise of the Soviet Union. The old powers were gone, but new powers were rising. The world was rapidly changing, and many people believed it was a chance to create something better. For many, this was a time of hope, a time when people believed that they could build a better world. But the scars of the war remained. The lessons learned from the war were never forgotten. The survivors picked up the pieces of their shattered lives, carrying the memory of the war with them. They hoped that nothing like it would ever happen again. A legacy of World War I. Today, when we think about World War I, we don't just remember the battles, the weapons, and the politics. We think about the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and the families torn apart. We remember the soldiers who went to war, not knowing they would never return. We think about the survivors who came home to find that their homes were no longer the same. Every memorial, every grave, and every symbol reminds us of what happened. The war may be over, but its legacy lives on. The soldiers who died are not just numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, and friends. We must never forget them. As we reflect on the war, we realize that the true lesson is not just about the horrors of war, but about the importance of peace. We must honor the memories of those who fought and died by making sure that their sacrifices were not in vain. We must work to create a world where such a terrible event never happens again. The fire of this war still burns in our hearts today. The lessons we learned about the dangers of unchecked nationalism, about the horrors of war, and about the power of resilience are lessons we must carry with us forever. The world has changed, but we must always remember. The pain and loss of World War I should never be forgotten. It is part of our history, and it serves as a reminder that peace must never be taken for granted. And so, the story of World War I ends, but its echoes will never fade. It is a story that will continue to teach us, shape us, and remind us of the importance of peace for generations to come.
Hey, if you learned something new today, please give this video a like. Write your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second and it really helps to create more English videos for you. Thank you. See you next time. Bye.